The hypocrisy of the free world, of the Western world, has reached screaming levels. Never before in recent memory can we recall that the world has been so biased, so slanted, so jaded in their shameless anti Semitism. I mean, taking information sources from a terrorist group and using that as fact, to use Hamas's casualty numbers as if they are the gold standard of science, as a fact to determine genocide, the rampant killing of innocent civilians in Gaza, to use Hamas propaganda numbers as as the foundation and the basis of claims such as serious as crimes against humanity, as genocide and deliberate starvation. It is stunning in its hypocrisy. But take a listen to how bad, in fact, is the hypocrisy coming out of the Western news media, and how biased they are against Jewish people all over the world, and of course in Israel. Take a listen.
So you've probably seen these photos of skeletal kids in Gaza on front pages, all over social media, even in a UNICEF ad. They've become the symbols of famine. But we decided to look into these photos and the stories behind them. And what we found is that in case after case, these kids were sick, but not just with malnutrition. In every instance, they were suffering with other conditions or illnesses like cystic fibrosis, cerebral palsy, and even traumatic head injuries. A few weeks ago, I started to notice that the same kids were appearing over and over again in coverage about Gaza, and they were being photographed by different photographers, which suggests some element of coordination. And then the New York Times had to issue an editor's note about this viral image, and that made me wonder, what else weren't they telling us about these photos? We did something so simple, it's shocking that no other journalist bothered to do it. So this is how we figured this out. Let's just take this example of Najwa Hussein Hajj, who appeared in CNN simply as suffering from severe malnutrition in Gaza City. So all we did is we took her name, we went to Google Translate, we took the Arabic spelling of her name, put that into Google, and pulled up a lot of local clips in which her parents were talking about what was really going on. And what we learned is that she has an esophagus condition, which is something that was even reported in English media, including the New York Times. That is a quite different and more nuanced story than the assumption that Israel wants her dead and they're starving her. The most important thing to realize is that the average Gazan does not look like that. And that is really what we find to be problematic about these images, is that they were being used by mainstream media in general stories about starvation. How is it that these legacy newsrooms lacked scrutiny for information coming out of an active war zone controlled by a terrorist group? Well, we asked them, and to figure out what they said and how they defended themselves, you should check out our story in the Free Press.
They say that if you've not read the news, then you're uninformed. But if you have read the news, then you're misinformed. And that is what's going on in the world media today. It's absolutely shocking. You see, there's actually two wars going on. There's the war in Israel, which is the war of rockets and missiles. But then there's the war in the West, which is the war of narratives. It's the war of spinning their story in a way that portrays the victim, Israel, as the bully, the aggressor. It makes no sense. But if you say a lie enough times, like the Nazi propaganda genius Joseph Goebbels said, may his name be blotted out and erased. He said that if you say a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. And that's what they're doing, shouting out the lies against Israel in the echo chamber of the Western media, echoing all over the internet and all over the television screens and cable TVs and Facebook feeds and X and Instagram and everything else. They say the lie enough times, and it simply becomes a fait accompli. The Torah teaches us about the dangers that lead to the breakdown in society. There is one sin which is worse than all the other sins put together. You know, the three worst sins in Judaism, the three most serious sins in Torah are murder, adultery, and idolatry. These are the three sins about which a person should rather give up his life than be forced to commit them. Again, it's murder, adultery, and idolatry. However, the Talmud says that there is one sin that's equivalent to all three of those, and that is the sin of evil tongue. Lashon hara, the evil tongue. The sin of speaking badly about another person is the sin that tears down society, that destroys the world, and brings God's wrath upon the person who delivers this evil and false information. If you want to see just how bad it is, not only in the media, but now how it's weaponized in the halls of the United Nations, then watch this very disturbing clip from Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Here it goes.
The hypocrisy of the UN in action. At the beginning, they put together a fabricated report about starvation or famine in Gaza, full of lies, full of manipulation. Then they called for a Security Council debate, and now you have a press conference of more than 10 ambassadors of the Security Council blaming Israel. They will not say a word about the hostages. We will continue the fight until we will bring back all the hostages. This is the hypocrisy we are dealing with, but we are not deterred by it. We will continue until we will finish the job.
You know, it's interesting. There's a piece of Torah that I've never understood until today. The Torah tells us that the exile that the Jewish people are in right now, the current exile, the very last exile in which the Jewish people find themselves now, is compared to a pig. Why is it compared to a pig? Because the pig is the only animal who has kosher signs on the outside, but on the inside is non-kosher. Remember, the two signs of a kosher animal, according to the Bible, are that it has to have split hooves, and also it needs to ruminate. It needs to chew the cud. You know, when you see a cow that's just sitting on the side of the road and just chewing, moving its lips, what's it doing? What it's doing is it's regurgitating the food that it already ate before, and it's chewing it over. The cows have more than one stomach. So it brings it back up and it chews the cud over and over and over again. So for an animal to be kosher, it's going to have both signs. The inside sign is chewing the cud, ruminating, and the outside sign is the split hooves. Camels, for example, horses don't have split hooves, and therefore they're not kosher. Pigs are the only animals that have split hooves on the outside, but on the inside are not kosher. So to the outside viewer, to the superficial perspective, they look kosher. But from the inside, when you look deep inside, you realize that they're not kosher. And this is the reason why this final exile is compared to a pig, because this final exile will be the exile of hypocrisy, is what the Torah tells us. Now, I've never properly understood what that meant until I realized what's going on here today in the war of narratives after October 7th. The world turns a blind eye to the plight of the hostages who are languishing to this very day. 22 hostages, at least we know of, are alive in Gaza, being deliberately starved, tortured, raped, humiliated, and denied their basic human rights. Even the Red Cross is not allowed to visit them. Yet, what does the Western media choose to report? Only the fabricated lies of suffering of innocent children in Gaza by taking a story, a deliberate lie of a child who's suffering from some genetic terrible disease, and putting that in the front cover of newspapers all over the world, knowing that the world is only going to read the headline and nobody's going to even notice the retraction, which appears days later, not on the front page, of course, in full color, but on page 64, buried in the back of the newspaper. Buried by the Times is actually a newspaper it's actually a book that exposes the New York Times, how they deliberately hid the atrocities of the Holocaust during World War II. The New York Times refused to report the atrocities of the Nazis during the World War II, during the Holocaust, buried by the Times. And that's exactly what's happening today. They are burying the true suffering in Gaza, which is the suffering of the hostages of Israel inside of Gaza, and the suffering of the civilians in Gaza that are suffering at the hands of the Hamas terrorists that are brutalizing them and using them as cannon fodder to promote their death cult cause. But now I finally understand why this exile is compared to a pig, because this exile is one which is plagued with hypocrisy, a world that cries out human rights, a world that cries out in the name of decency, in the name of ethics and morality, yet buried just beneath their superficial behavior is their macabre atrocities, as they themselves, like these dignitaries in the United Nations, are making up numbers, inventing a famine, literally moving the goalposts in order to suit their narratives, because they couldn't come up with a famine in Gaza, so they needed to redefine the famine statistics in order to be able to qualify for what they call a famine, in order to portray, to vilify Israel, the victim, as in fact the aggressor. But don't be afraid, because the Rebbe spoke to Bibi Netanyahu when he was a young ambassador to Israel's ambassador to the United Nations in the 1980s. The Rebbe said to him, "The United Nations is a house full of darkness. It's a house of lies," the Rebbe told him. And the way to deal with darkness is by lighting a light. Kindle a flame, strike a match, and your little light will banish a disproportionate amount of darkness. Speak the truth without apology and without fear. We need to do this in the halls of the UN. We need to do this on Main Street. We need to do this in the boardrooms of our businesses, in the dining rooms of our homes. We need to do this in social media. We need to speak the truth, because just like light banishes darkness, so too the truth will dispel the lie and expose the hypocrisy. Don't be afraid. Hashem has got our back.